Hey guys, tonight we're stepping away from the usual narratives you might remember from grade school. The ones that painted vast emptiness across two continents before 1492. We're going to slow down, breathe deep, and explore something far more intricate. The civilizations that built, governed, traded, and thrived across the Americas for thousands of years before European ships appeared on the horizon. This isn't about correcting anyone or proving points. It's just history, quietly waiting to be seen more clearly. If you're settling in from somewhere across the globe, drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you are. I love seeing this community stretch across time zones. And if you enjoy these deep dives into the past, consider subscribing. It helps us keep these journeys going. Now, let's begin somewhere unexpected. You're standing in what is now southern Illinois, near the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. The year is 1050 CE, around the time Norman forces are preparing to cross the English Channel. But here, you're looking at something that rivals anything being built in Europe at that moment. A city called Cahokia. Before you stretches an urban center of perhaps 20,000 people, maybe more. The population estimates shift as new archaeological techniques reveal previously hidden residential areas. But what's certain is this. Cahokia was larger than London at the same time. At its heart rises Monk's Mound, a terraced earthen pyramid that covers 14 acres at its base and climbs 10 stories into the prairie sky. You watch workers carrying baskets of earth up wooden staircases, adding to the structure that will eventually contain 22 million cubic feet of soil, moved entirely by human labor, one basket at a time. The mound isn't just large. It's oriented precisely to the cardinal directions. From its summit, the ruler or religious leader can observe the sunrise align with specific wooden posts during solstices and equinoxes, a calendar built into the landscape itself. These posts, called woodhenge by modern archaeologists, form a circle 410 feet in diameter. Scholars debate exactly what ceremonies occurred here, what astronomical knowledge was encoded in these alignments, but the precision is undeniable. Around the central plaza, you see smaller mounds, more than 120 of them originally, though many have been lost to time and plows. Each likely served specific purposes: platforms for elite residences, burial sites for important figures, foundations for ceremonial structures. The city is divided into neighborhoods, each with its own plaza and smaller mounds. Wooden palisade walls, rebuilt multiple times, suggest both defensive concerns and social boundaries. Some archaeologists argue these walls primarily mark sacred space. Others emphasize their defensive function. The truth might contain elements of both. You walk through residential areas where thatched houses cluster in organized rows. Artifacts scattered in the soil, broken pottery, stone tools, discarded food remains, reveal daily life. People cooking corn-based meals, crafting elaborate ceremonial objects from copper brought from Lake Superior, creating shell beads from marine shells traded from the Gulf Coast, hundreds of miles south. The trade networks implied by these materials suggest Cahokia wasn't isolated, but rather sat at the center of a vast exchange system. What caused Cahokia's eventual decline around 1350 CE remains uncertain. Some evidence points to environmental stress, perhaps deforestation, perhaps flooding, perhaps both. Other researchers emphasize political fragmentation or the exhaustion of local resources. Still others note climate shifts that affected agriculture. Likely, multiple factors combined in ways we're still working to understand. But here's what matters for tonight. Cahokia wasn't unique. It was the largest, yes, but it was part of a broader Mississippian culture that built earthen mound centers across the Southeast and Midwest. From Moundville in Alabama to Etowah in Georgia to Spiro in Oklahoma, similar patterns emerge. Organized settlements, complex social hierarchies, astronomical knowledge encoded in architecture, extensive trade networks. These weren't simple villages. They were urban centers with specialized labor, political administration, religious institutions, and cultural production. When you think about the Americas before 1492, this is part of what was here, not wilderness, but civilization in forms that didn't always match European expectations, but were sophisticated nonetheless. The evening air over Cahokia carries smoke from cooking fires, the sound of voices in a language now lost, the rhythmic thud of wooden tools shaping the earth into monumental forms. Somewhere, ceremonies unfold that we can only glimpse through archaeological fragments. The civilization you're witnessing will endure for centuries, will shape the lives of thousands, will leave traces that puzzle and intrigue researchers a millennium later. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking through what appears to be forest, dense, green, seemingly untouched. But look closer. The trees aren't randomly distributed. Chestnuts cluster in groves, too uniform to be accidental. Oaks dominate certain hillsides where their acorns would be easiest to gather. Undergrowth is unusually sparse in some areas, thick with berry bushes in others. This forest has a pattern, and that pattern has a purpose. What you're seeing isn't wilderness. It's a garden that's been tended for thousands of years. For centuries, the prevailing assumption in European and later American thought was that the pre-Columbian Americas were largely pristine wilderness, touched only lightly by scattered groups of nomadic peoples. This idea served various purposes. It made colonization seem less like displacement and more like empty land being put to productive use. It shaped conservation philosophy, environmental policy, even modern ideas about what natural means. But it wasn't accurate. Indigenous peoples across the Americas actively shaped their environments through practices so sophisticated and so sustained that the landscape itself became a form of cultural expression. In what is now California, native groups used controlled burns to manage forests for millennia. These weren't accidental fires. They were carefully timed, strategically placed burns that cleared underbrush, reduced the risk of catastrophic wildfires, promoted the growth of specific plant species, and created habitat for deer and other game animals. The result was a landscape that early Spanish explorers described as park-like, open, with widely spaced trees and clear sight lines. When you read their accounts, they're often puzzled by this appearance, noting that the forests seem almost manicured. They didn't immediately understand they were looking at deliberate environmental management. Some scholars argue these fire practices were so extensive that their sudden cessation after European diseases decimated indigenous populations may have contributed to the unusually dense, fire-prone forest colonists encountered in later centuries. The debate continues about the extent and impact of these practices, but the basic fact of intentional landscape management is now well established. Move east to the Atlantic coast, and you find forests dominated by nut-producing trees in proportions that suggest centuries of selective cultivation. Chestnuts, which were once far more common than they are today, were effectively semi-domesticated. Indigenous peoples planted them near settlements, protected young trees, and harvested the reliable food source they provided. When the chestnut blight devastated these trees in the early 20th century, it wasn't just an ecological tragedy. It was the loss of a food system that had sustained communities for millennia. In the Amazon basin, what once looked like pristine rainforest turns out to contain forest islands, patches of unusually fertile soil enriched with charcoal and organic matter, now called terra preta. These dark earth zones indicate long-term human habitation and intensive cultivation. Trees growing on terra preta sites are often useful species, Brazil nuts, cacao, palms, distributed in patterns that suggest planting rather than natural occurrence. Some researchers estimate that up to 12% of the Amazon's forests may show signs of pre-Columbian human modification. Others consider this figure too high. Archaeological surveys continue to refine these estimates. The Great Plains, often imagined as endless empty grasslands where buffalo roamed without human influence, were also shaped by indigenous fire management. Regular burning maintained the grasslands themselves, preventing encroachment by woody plants, promoting the growth of grasses that buffalo preferred, and creating the edge habitats where multiple ecosystems met, zones of particular abundance for hunting and gathering. The vast buffalo herds that European and American settlers encountered weren't simply a natural phenomenon. They were, in part, the result of millennia of landscape management. You're standing now in the Northeast, in forests where indigenous peoples cleared patches for agriculture using a combination of burning and hand labor. These clearings weren't permanent. They were part of a rotation system, fields used for several years, then allowed to return to forest while new fields were opened elsewhere. The result was a mosaic landscape, a patchwork of fields at different stages of succession, forests at different ages, clearings and dense woods interspersed in patterns that maximized ecological diversity and food availability. This wasn't farming as Europeans practiced it. Fixed fields, permanent clearings, intensive single-crop agriculture. It was something more flexible, more integrated with existing ecosystems. And because it didn't look like European farming, early colonists often didn't recognize it as agriculture at all. They saw unused land where indigenous peoples saw a carefully managed system. The chestnut groves, the open pine forests, the berry patches, the nut-bearing trees clustered near ancient village sites. All of this constituted a form of environmental engineering that worked with ecological processes rather than against them. It sustained large populations without exhausting the land. It created abundance without depleting resources. When European diseases swept through indigenous populations in the 16th and 17th centuries, these management practices largely ceased. Forests grew denser. Underbrush accumulated. Fire patterns changed. The landscape that later colonists encountered and assumed was primeval wilderness was often actually ecological succession following demographic collapse. Nature reclaiming land that had been actively managed for thousands of years. Understanding this reshapes how we think about conservation, about wilderness, about what's natural. The forests aren't just forests. They're cultural landscapes, shaped by human hands operating with deep ecological knowledge accumulated over countless generations. The wilderness was a garden. The garden appeared to be wilderness only because the gardeners were gone. You're standing in southern Ohio, looking across a landscape that seems to defy easy explanation. Before you stretches an earthwork in the shape of a serpent, its sinuous body winding across the plateau for more than 1,300 feet. The snake's mouth appears to be consuming, or perhaps releasing, an oval shape. The body curves and undulates with remarkable precision, following the contours of the land while maintaining its symbolic form. This is Serpent Mound, and it represents only one example of geometric earthworks that stretch across the Ohio River Valley and beyond. You're looking at engineering, astronomy, and symbolic expression merged into landscape-scale monuments that required extensive planning, coordinated labor, and mathematical sophistication. The people who built these structures, now often referred to as the Hopewell culture, though that term encompasses multiple related groups across several centuries, left no written records that we've yet deciphered. We can't read their intentions directly, but we can measure their constructions, analyze their alignments, and recognize patterns that reveal deep knowledge of geometry and celestial mechanics. Move north to Newark, Ohio, and you encounter something even more geometrically complex. The Newark earthworks, originally covering more than 4 square miles. What remains today includes the Great Circle, a perfect circular embankment 1,200 feet in diameter, and the Octagon earthworks, connected to a circle by parallel walls. The octagon's 8 sides are precisely constructed, each wall segment measuring approximately 550 feet. The angles are exact. The alignments are deliberate. And here's where it gets particularly intriguing. The octagon aligns with the moon's 18.6-year cycle, specifically the northernmost rising point of the moon at its maximum declination. This is an approximate. When archaeoastronomers Ray Hively and Robert Horn conducted surveys in the 1980s, they found that the earthworks corners and central sight lines marked the moon's extreme positions with remarkable accuracy. The builders tracked lunar cycles over decades, encoded that knowledge into Earth and geometry, and created a structure that functioned as both calendar and a ceremonial space. Some scholars debate the precision of these alignments, arguing that the margin of error in ancient construction might produce apparent correlations by chance. Others counter with statistical analyses showing the alignments are too consistent, too numerous to be accidental. The debate reflects healthy scientific skepticism, but the weight of evidence increasingly supports intentional astronomical orientation. You're walking now along the geometric earthworks near Chillicothe, where circles, squares, and octagons combine in complex arrangements. These aren't random shapes. They're precise geometric forms connected by carefully constructed passageways. Circles with diameters that maintain consistent proportions. Squares oriented to cardinal directions. Enclosures that required earth moving on a massive scale. Millions of cubic feet of soil dug with stone and wooden tools, carried in baskets, shaped into walls and embankments. The Hopewell culture flourished roughly from 100 BCE to 500 CE, though dating remains somewhat uncertain and construction periods varied by site. During this time, communities across the Ohio Valley and into surrounding regions built these earthworks, maintained trade networks that brought materials from across the continent, and developed social structures capable of organizing large-scale collective projects. Inside some mounds, archaeologists have found burial chambers containing artifacts that speak to the extent of these trade connections. Copper from Lake Superior, mica from the Appalachian Mountains, obsidian from Yellowstone, shark teeth from the Gulf of Mexico, grizzly bear teeth from the Rocky Mountains. These materials traveled hundreds or thousands of miles. The networks that moved them required communication, trust, and established routes of exchange. But the mounds weren't just burial sites. Many served as platforms for structures, boundaries for ceremonial spaces, or markers in the landscape. Some may have had astronomical functions. Others likely held meanings we can only guess at. The Hopewell people left us the physical structures, but not the stories that explained them. Further south, in the Mississippi Valley, you find different but equally impressive geometric earthworks. Poverty Point in Louisiana, built around 1650 to 700 BC, centuries before the Hopewell culture emerged. Here, concentric semicircular ridges form a design that, from above, looks like an enormous half-octagon. The outer ridge measures 3/4 of a mile across. People lived on these ridges, their houses perched atop the earthen embankments. At the site's center, a plaza could hold thousands of people for gatherings whose purposes we can only infer from the architecture itself. Poverty Point's construction required moving an estimated 30 million cubic feet of earth. The ridges are precisely spaced. The overall design suggests planning on a scale that required both mathematical knowledge and social organization. Someone had to envision the complete structure, communicate that vision, coordinate the labor, and maintain the project over the years or decades it took to complete. What's particularly striking is that these geometric earthworks appear across different time periods and cultures, from the Archaic period sites like Poverty Point through the Hopewell period and into the later Mississippian culture. The specific forms change: circles, squares, octagons, serpents, platforms, but the impulse to encode meaning into landscape-scale geometry persists. You stand again at Serpent Mound as evening approaches. The snake's body glows in the low light, its curves following the natural topography while creating something entirely cultural. Whether it marked solstice alignments, as some researchers suggest, or served other ceremonial purposes, it represents a way of thinking about space, time, and meaning that we're still working to understand fully. The mathematical precision isn't accidental. The astronomical alignments aren't coincidental. These are deliberate constructions by people with sophisticated understanding of geometry, celestial cycles, and engineering principles. They built knowledge into the earth itself, creating monuments that have outlasted their civilizations by more than a millennium, still posing questions we haven't entirely answered. You're holding a piece of copper from Lake Superior. It's in your hand somewhere along the Gulf Coast, more than 1,000 miles from where it was mined. The metal is cold, slightly greenish, worked into the shape of an earring or perhaps a ceremonial ornament. Someone carried this copper south, or rather, many someones, passing it hand to hand through a network of exchange that spanned the continent. Trade in the pre-Columbian Americas wasn't a simple matter of neighboring villages swapping goods. It was continental in scope, sophisticated in organization, and sustained over centuries. The routes that moved copper, shells, obsidian, turquoise, and countless other materials created connections between distant peoples, spread ideas and technologies, and linked diverse cultures into broader systems of exchange. Start in the Great Lakes region, where native peoples mined copper from surface deposits and underground veins. This wasn't casual collection. Archaeological evidence from Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula in Michigan shows mining pits, some quite deep, with stone hammers and wooden wedges left in place. The mining occurred over thousands of years, from the Archaic period through historic times. Estimates of the total copper extracted run into thousands of tons, though exact figures remain debated. This copper traveled. You find it in Ohio burial mounds, in Mississippi Valley sites, along the Gulf Coast, even in some southwestern locations. The copper was cold-hammered into sheets, shaped into ornaments, incorporated into ceremonial objects. Its presence far from its source indicates established routes of exchange and relationships between communities separated by vast distances. Now you're holding a shell from the Gulf of Mexico, standing in Ohio. It's a conch shell, transformed into a ceremonial cup or gorget, a throat ornament worn by elite individuals. The shell traveled north through multiple hands, each exchange representing a relationship, a connection, perhaps a diplomatic tie between communities. Marine shells appear throughout the interior of the continent, valued not just for their beauty, but for their rarity, their origin from places most people would never see. Move west to the southwest, and you encounter turquoise, that distinctive blue-green stone mine in what is now New Mexico and Arizona. Turquoise appears in burial sites throughout the region, but it also traveled much farther. Pieces have been found in Hopewell Mounds in Ohio, in Mexican sites hundreds of miles south, carried along trade networks that crossed deserts, mountains, and cultural boundaries. The ancient Southwest was crisscrossed with trails that connected pueblos, linked communities to distant resources, and facilitated exchange over hundreds of miles. Some of these trails were so well established, used for so long, that they wore grooves into sandstone bedrock, literal pathways carved by countless footsteps over centuries. You can still see some of these grooves today, ancient highways preserved in stone. Obsidian, volcanic glass, prized for its sharpness and workability, moved along similarly extensive networks. Obsidian from Yellowstone appears in Ohio Hopewell sites. Obsidian from Oregon sources shows up in California. Mexican obsidian reaches the American Southwest. Each piece can be traced to its geological source through chemical analysis, revealing the specific volcano where the stone originated. Mapping these distributions shows trade networks operating over distances of 1,000 miles or more. But what exactly were people trading? The archaeological record preserves imperishable goods, stone, copper, shell, but the networks likely carried much more. Textiles, furs, dried foods, medicinal plants, pigments, feathers. All these would have moved along the same routes, leaving little or no archaeological trace. The visible items might represent only a fraction of the actual exchange. Consider cacao. In Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, archaeologists found residues of cacao in ceramic vessels dating to around 1000 CE. Cacao only grows in tropical regions, more than 1,000 miles south of Chaco. Its presence indicates either direct trade connections extending into Mesoamerica or intermediate networks that moved goods stepwise across vast distances. The debate continues about whether Chacoan peoples had direct contact with Mexican civilizations or received goods through intermediary groups. But either way, the connections existed. You're walking now along an ancient trail in the southwest, following the path between pueblos. The trail is worn smooth, marked by cairns at intervals, sometimes featuring small shrines where travelers might leave offerings. This isn't just a path from point A to point B. It's a social connection, a relationship maintained through regular travel, exchange, and communication. Trade routes required safety. Travelers needed places to stay, protection from hazards, established protocols for exchange. The existence of these networks implies social structures that made long-distance travel possible. Perhaps relationships of kinship extended across regions, perhaps formal diplomatic arrangements, perhaps religious connections that provided safe passage. We can infer these structures from the archaeological evidence of exchange, even when direct records don't survive. Some scholars argue that what we call trade might be better understood as gift exchange, formalized reciprocity that created and maintained social bonds rather than simple economic transactions. In this model, the copper earring or shell gorget wasn't just valuable in itself, but represented a relationship, an obligation, a connection between giver and receiver. The debate over terminology reflects different ways of understanding ancient economies and social structures. The Mississippian period saw perhaps the most extensive trade networks, centered on major mound cities like Cahokia, but extending far beyond. A merchant or trader from Cahokia might journey to the Great Lakes for copper, to the Gulf for shells, to the Appalachians for mica, creating circuits of exchange that tied together vast regions. Whether individuals made these long journeys or goods passed through many intermediate hands remains uncertain, but the connections functioned reliably enough to move materials across the continent. By the time European ships arrived on the coasts, these trade networks had been operating for thousands of years. They weren't primitive or simple. They were sophisticated systems that moved goods, ideas, technologies, and cultural practices across distances that still impress us today. The copper in your hand traveled farther than most medieval European trade goods, following routes as old as any in the world. You're kneeling in a field in what is now central Mexico, around 7000 BCE. In your hand is a seed head for a wild grass called teosinte. It's small, nothing like the corn you know from modern farms. The seeds are tiny, encased in hard shells, arranged in a single row. This unpromising plant will become, over thousands of years of careful selection and cultivation, one of the most important food sources in human history. The transformation from teosinte to maize represents one of the most dramatic examples of plant domestication anywhere in the world. Wild teosinte and modern corn look so different that for decades, botanists debated whether they could even be related. Genetic analysis eventually confirmed they are the same species, separated by millennia of human selection. Someone long ago noticed that some teosinte plants had slightly larger seeds, or seeds that were easier to thresh, or stalks that grew a bit taller. They saved those seeds, planted them, selected again from the next generation, repeated this process across lifetimes, across centuries. By 5000 BCE, recognizable corn cobs appear in the archaeological record, still small, still far from modern varieties, but clearly distinct from wild teosinte. The process continued. Each generation of farmers chose the best plants, saved the best seeds, slowly, incrementally improving the crop. By 3000 BCE, corn had spread from its origin point in southern Mexico into other regions. By 2000 BCE, it was cultivated throughout Mesoamerica. Eventually, it would reach the American Southwest, the Mississippi Valley, the Great Lakes region, adapting to different climates, different growing seasons, different soils. But corn didn't travel alone. You're standing now in a field where three plants grow together in a carefully managed relationship. Corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters as they're known in many indigenous traditions. This isn't random companion planting. It's an agricultural system that took centuries to develop, combining three domesticated crops in ways that enhance all three. The corn grows tall, providing a structure for bean vines to climb. The beans, being legumes, fix nitrogen in the soil, enriching it for the heavy-feeding corn. The squash spreads along the ground, its broad leaves shading the soil, retaining moisture and suppressing weeds. Together, the three plants provide a nutritionally complete diet: corn for calories and carbohydrates, bean for protein, squash for vitamins and minerals. And together, they're easier to grow than any one would be alone, each supporting the others in a carefully balanced system. The development of this system required observation, experimentation, and accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. Someone had to notice that beans grew better near corn stalks. Someone had to recognize that squash planted beneath both provided benefits. Someone had to maintain these practices long enough for them to become established tradition, encoded in cultural knowledge and passed to descendants. Beyond the three sisters, indigenous peoples domesticated dozens of other crops: amaranth, quinoa, potatoes, sweet potatoes, cassava, peanuts, sunflowers, peppers, tomatoes, avocados, cacao, vanilla. The list is remarkable in its diversity and in its global impact. These crops now feed billions of people worldwide, but they originated in the Americas, developed through patient selection by farmers who understood plant genetics long before that term existed. Consider potatoes, domesticated in the Andes around 8,000 BCE. Wild potatoes are small, bitter, sometimes toxic. Through selection, Andean farmers developed hundreds of varieties adapted to different altitudes, different climates, different growing conditions. Some varieties grow at 14,000 feet above sea level, in conditions where few other crops survive. This diversification wasn't random. It was deliberate crop development, responding to specific environmental challenges. Or consider cassava, domesticated in the Amazon basin. Wild cassava contains cyanide compounds that can be toxic if not properly processed. Someone figured out how to soak, press, and cook cassava to remove the toxins while retaining its nutritional value. This knowledge, which varieties to use, how to process them, how long to cook them, became essential survival information, passed down through generations as carefully as any written text. The agricultural knowledge wasn't just about which plants to grow. It included when a plant based on seasonal indicators, how to prepare soil, how to manage water, how to store seeds for next year's planting, how to process and preserve harvests. In the Southwest, farmers developed sophisticated irrigation systems to bring water to fields in an arid climate. In the Amazon, raised field systems allowed cultivation in seasonally flooded areas. In the eastern woodlands, the rotation clearing system we discussed earlier maintained soil fertility without exhausting the land. Some researchers estimate that by 1492, indigenous peoples in the Americas had domesticated more major crops than farmers in any other part of the world. The exact numbers are debated. Definitions of major crops vary, and some plants fall into gray areas between wild and domesticated. But the basic point stands. Agricultural innovation in the Americas was extraordinarily productive. This wasn't primitive farming. It was sophisticated plant breeding conducted without the benefit of written records or scientific instruments, relying instead on careful observation, experimentation, and accumulated cultural knowledge. The farmers who developed these crops understood heredity, variation, selection pressure, and adaptation. They applied these principles practically generation after generation, creating food systems that sustained millions of people. When Europeans arrived and saw fields of corn, beans, and squash growing together, They didn't always recognize the sophistication of what they were observing. The system looked different from European agriculture with its monocrop fields and heavy plowing. But different doesn't mean less advanced. The Three Sisters system was elegantly adapted to its context, sustainable over centuries, and nutritionally superior to many old-world agricultural practices. You're holding corn seeds now, preparing to plant next season's crop. These seeds represent thousands of years of human effort, countless individual decisions by farmers selecting the best plants, saving the best seeds, gradually transforming a wild grass into one of the world's most important crops. The knowledge in your hands, which varieties grow best in your soil, when to plant, how to arrange them with beans and squash, is as valuable as any written text, as sophisticated as any scientific treatise. It's just encoded differently, passed down through practice and oral instruction rather than written words. You're sitting in a longhouse in what is now upstate New York, sometime in the 15th or 16th century. The exact date remains a subject of scholarly debate. Around you, representatives from 5 nations have gathered: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. They're here to discuss matters affecting all their peoples, to resolve disputes, to coordinate responses to external threats. This is the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois League, and it represents a form of political organization that challenges simplistic narratives about governance in pre-Columbian North America. The Haudenosaunee system wasn't a centralized state in the European sense. It was something more flexible, a confederation where individual nations maintained sovereignty while participating in collective decision-making for matters of mutual concern. Each nation sent representatives, called sachems or chiefs, chosen according to their own internal processes. These representatives met in grand councils where decisions required consensus, not simple majority votes. Consensus meant everyone had to agree, or at least everyone had to accept the decision. This could make the process slow, but it also meant that adopted policies had broad support and that minority voices couldn't be simply overruled. The system built in mechanisms for discussion, for persuasion, for finding solutions that addressed multiple perspectives. Some scholars argue this approach was more democratic than contemporary European systems where monarchs or small aristocratic classes held power. Others note that Haudenosaunee society had its own hierarchies and that comparing different political systems requires careful attention to their distinct contexts. The League operated according to what's sometimes called the Great Law of Peace, an oral constitution that outlined procedures, responsibilities, and principles of governance. This wasn't written in the European sense, but it was formalized, memorized, recited, and passed down through generations of leaders trained specifically to remember and preserve it. The Great Law specified how sachems were chosen, how councils operated, how disputes were resolved, even provisions for removing leaders who failed their responsibilities. Women held significant political authority within the Haudenosaunee system, particularly the clan mothers who selected the sachems. If a sachem failed to adequately represent his people or violated the principles of the Great Law, clan mothers could remove him from office. This provided a check on leadership that operated through established cultural channels. European observers, accustomed to male-dominated political structures, sometimes struggled to understand or accurately report the role of women in Haudenosaunee governance. Move south to the Cherokee Nation, and you find different but equally sophisticated political structures. Cherokee towns maintained considerable autonomy, each with its own council house where community members gathered to discuss local matters. Decisions were made through extended discussion until consensus emerged. Leadership wasn't hereditary in the way European nobility operated. It was earned through demonstrated wisdom, eloquence, military success, or other valued qualities. The Cherokee system also recognized distinct spheres of authority. White chiefs or peace chiefs handled civil matters, diplomacy, and internal governance. Red chiefs or war chiefs led during times of conflict. This separation meant that wartime leaders didn't automatically control peacetime decisions, and that the skills valued in war weren't automatically transferred to civil governance. The transition between peace and war involved ceremonial processes and shifts in which leaders held primary authority. Further west, Plains peoples developed their own forms of political organization adapted to mobile lifestyles and buffalo hunting economies. Council systems brought together respected leaders, sometimes including military societies, sometimes age-graded organizations where different groups had different responsibilities. Leadership often emerged situationally. Particular individuals might lead specific hunts or raids based on their experience and success, while others handled diplomatic negotiations or resolved internal disputes. The diversity of these systems is important to recognize. There was no single model of indigenous governance any more than there was a single European model. Different peoples developed different structures suited to their particular circumstances, economies, and cultural values. But certain patterns recur: emphasis on discussion and consensus, respect for eloquence and persuasion over coercion, systems for removing leaders who failed their responsibilities, and political authority distributed across multiple individuals or groups rather than concentrated in single rulers. Some historians argue that these political systems influenced the development of democratic thought in colonial and early American contexts. Benjamin Franklin, among others, observed Haudenosaunee Council proceedings and commented on their representative character. Whether these observations directly shaped the U.S. Constitution remains debated. Some scholars see clear influence. Others argue for parallel development of democratic ideas from European Enlightenment sources. The truth likely involves both. Indigenous political models provided examples of confederation and representation, just as Enlightenment philosophy provided theoretical frameworks. What's less debatable is that these systems worked. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy maintained relative peace among its member nations for centuries, coordinated military responses to external threats, facilitated trade and communication across a substantial territory, and resolved internal disputes through established processes. This wasn't chaos or anarchy. It was organized governance operating through different mechanisms than European systems, but achieving similar functions: maintaining order, coordinating collective action, resolving conflicts, and providing frameworks for social cooperation. You're listening now as Sachems debate in council. The discussion has continued for hours, perhaps days. Each speaker presents arguments, appeals to tradition, invokes shared values, seeks common ground. No one is voting to cut off debate. No one is forcing a decision before consensus emerges. The process feels slow to you, accustomed perhaps to quicker decision-making, but you notice that when agreement finally comes, everyone accepts it. There are no dissenting minorities who feel overruled, no factions preparing to obstruct implementation. The time spent building consensus means the decision, once made, commands broad support. This is governance as patient discussion, as collective reasoning, as the art of persuasion rather than the exercise of force. It's not the only way to organize political authority, but it's a sophisticated approach that sustained complex societies across generations. When Europeans encountered these systems, they sometimes failed to recognize them as governance at all, expecting kings and courts and written laws. But governance takes many forms, and the absence of European-style institutions didn't mean the absence of political order. It meant different kinds of order, organized according to different principles, suited to different contexts. You're standing on a hillside overlooking a valley in what is now Peru, around 1520 CE. Below you stretches a landscape dense with agricultural terraces, irrigation channels, settlements clustered along the valley floor and climbing the slopes. People move along well-maintained roads, carrying goods to market, traveling between communities. The population here is substantial. Thousands of people within view, part of a larger system that extends across the Andes and into the coastal regions. Now, jump forward 30 years. The same hillside, the same valley. But something has changed. The terraces are still there, the irrigation channels remain, the roads continue to connect settlements. But the people are fewer. Not slightly fewer, dramatically fewer. Where thousands lived, hundreds remain. The difference is stark, visible, profound. What happened in those 30 years was disease, primarily smallpox, but also measles, typhus, influenza, and other old world pathogens to which indigenous peoples had no prior exposure and therefore no immunity. These diseases arrived with European contact and spread faster than the Europeans themselves, moving along established trade routes, jumping from community to community, devastating populations before most people had even seen a European face. The numbers are difficult to establish with certainty, and they've been subject to intense scholarly debate for decades. Early estimates of pre-Columbian populations in the Americas range from 8 to 10 million. By the 1960s and 1970s, scholars like Henry Dobbins were arguing for much higher figures, perhaps 90 million or more. These higher estimates were controversial, challenged by other researchers who considered them inflated. Current scholarly consensus tends to settle somewhere in between, with most estimates for total pre-Columbian population ranging from 50 to 60 million, though some scholars argue for figures as low as 40 million or as high as 100 million. The uncertainty reflects real methodological challenges. We're trying to estimate population for societies that left limited written records, that experienced catastrophic decline before systematic surveys occurred, and whose archaeological footprints we're still uncovering. Different methods produce different results. Archaeological site surveys, carrying capacity calculations based on agricultural systems, extrapolations from early colonial records, analysis of abandoned settlement patterns. Each approach has strengths and limitations. What's less uncertain is that the population decline was massive, probably the largest demographic catastrophe in human history. Estimates suggest mortality rates of 80 to 95% in many regions within a century of first contact. Some communities disappeared entirely. Others contracted dramatically, consolidating survivors from multiple devastated villages. The scale is difficult to comprehend. Tens of millions of people gone within several generations. You're in the Mississippi Valley now, around 1540, when Hernando de Soto's expedition passes through. Spanish chroniclers describe large towns, cultivated fields extending for miles, organized polities with clear hierarchies and substantial populations. De Soto and his men encounter thousands of people, pass through dozens of settlements, witness a functioning and populous society, return to the same region 150 years later. French explorers describe a landscape much emptier, with fewer people, abandoned towns, forests reclaiming fields. The change is dramatic enough that some early historians assumed the Spanish accounts were exaggerated. But archaeological evidence increasingly confirms the Spanish descriptions. The large settlements existed, the populations were substantial, and then they collapsed. The disease transmission happened through multiple mechanisms. Sometimes Europeans directly introduced pathogens to communities they encountered. More often, diseases spread through indigenous trade networks and social connections, reaching inland populations years or decades before Europeans arrived in those regions. A trader returning from the coast might carry smallpox to his home community hundreds of miles inland. The disease would devastate that community, then spread to neighboring groups through normal patterns of interaction. This means that much of the depopulation occurred before detailed European observation and recording. By the time colonists arrived in many regions and began documenting what they saw, the catastrophic population decline had already occurred. The wilderness they described was often a landscape still recovering from demographic collapse, not a pristine environment untouched by human impact. Consider New England, where English colonists arrived in the 1620s and found what they described as empty land, providentially cleared for their use. But archaeological evidence and indigenous oral histories tell a different story. The region had been densely populated until a devastating epidemic, probably plague or viral hepatitis, though the exact disease remains debated, swept through coastal communities around 1616 to 1619, killing an estimated 90% of the indigenous population. The empty land was actually recently emptied, its inhabitants dead just years before English arrival. The demographic collapse had cascading effects beyond the immediate mortality. Social structures broke down when so many people died so quickly. Knowledge holders, elders who maintained oral traditions, specialists who understood complex technologies, leaders who coordinated collective activities, died before they could fully train successors. Agricultural systems that required coordinated labor became difficult to maintain with depleted populations. Trade networks fragmented. Political confederacies dissolved or reorganized dramatically. Some scholars argue that the population collapse was so severe it had global environmental effects. The abandonment of agricultural fields across the Americas may have allowed forest regrowth on such a scale that it affected atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, possibly contributing to the Little Ice Age cooling period. This hypothesis remains debated, but it illustrates the sheer scale of the demographic change we're discussing. You're holding a census record now from early colonial Mexico. Try to reconstruct pre-contact population levels. The numbers you have are from after the catastrophe, after multiple waves of disease had already swept through. You're working backward from fragmentary evidence, trying to estimate what existed before, knowing that much of what you're trying to count has vanished, leaving only traces in the landscape and hints in incomplete records. The population debate isn't just academic. It shapes how we understand pre-Columbian civilizations, whether we see them as small, scattered groups or as substantial, complex societies. It affects how we interpret archaeological sites, how we estimate the scale of agricultural systems, how we understand political organizations. Higher population estimates mean more sophisticated infrastructure, more complex social organization, more extensive environmental management. The numbers matter because they tell us what was here, what was lost, what we're trying to understand through fragmentary evidence of something that was much larger than what survived. You're standing on a beach in the Caribbean in October 1492, watching ships anchor offshore. 3 vessels, their sails furled, their crews preparing to come ashore. You've never seen anything like these ships, their size, their construction, the pale-skinned men who emerge from them speaking a language you don't recognize. This moment, often framed as discovery, is actually something more complex. First contact between societies that had developed in isolation from each other for thousands of years. The crews stepping onto the sand are exhausted from weeks at sea, seeking fresh water, food, perhaps gold, or other valuables they can bring back to their sponsors. They carry technologies you've never encountered: steel swords, firearms, horses, writing systems, navigational instruments. But you and your community possess knowledge they lack. How to cultivate crops in this climate, which plants are medicinal, how to navigate these islands, where to find food and water. Both sides have sophistication. Both sides have gaps in knowledge. Neither fully understands what this meeting will mean. Columbus believed he had reached Asia, the East Indies specifically. This wasn't ignorance so much as reasonable inference based on available information. He knew the Earth was round, knew roughly its circumference, though his calculations were somewhat off. He didn't know that 2 massive continents lay between Europe and Asia. No European did. The Americas weren't on their maps because, from their perspective, these landmasses shouldn't exist here. For indigenous peoples, the arrival was equally puzzling. Some communities initially thought the ships might be floating islands, the pale visitors perhaps spirits or beings from another realm. These weren't naive interpretations. They were reasonable attempts to categorize something unprecedented within existing frameworks of understanding. Early interactions involved both sides trying to comprehend the other through their own cultural lenses, often misinterpreting intentions, meanings, and social cues. The technology gap was real, but not absolute. Europeans had advantages in metallurgy, steel tools and weapons, metal armor. They had firearms, though early firearms were slow to reload, inaccurate, and often unreliable. They had horses, which were unknown in the Americas and initially terrifying to indigenous peoples who encountered them. They had ocean-going ships capable of crossing the Atlantic, though indigenous peoples had sophisticated watercraft suited to their own environments. But in many domains, indigenous peoples held equal or superior knowledge. Agricultural systems in the Americas were often more sophisticated than European farming. Indigenous medicine included effective treatments unknown in Europe. Quinine for malaria, coca as an anesthetic, dozens of other plants with genuine pharmaceutical properties. Astronomical knowledge in Mesoamerica and the Andes matched or exceeded European understanding in certain areas. The technology gap went both ways, though European advantages in military technology proved decisive in many conflicts. You're in Tenochtitlan now, the Aztec capital, in 1519 when Hernán Cortés arrives. The city is magnificent, perhaps 200,000 inhabitants, larger than any European city except possibly Constantinople. Causeways connect the island city to the shore. Aqueducts bring fresh water from distant springs. Markets bustle with goods from across Mesoamerica. The Great Temple dominates the central plaza, its twin pyramids rising above the surrounding buildings. Cortés and his small force of several hundred Spanish soldiers are vastly outnumbered, but they carry advantages: steel weapons, horses, a few cannons, and critically, the ability to form alliances with indigenous groups who resent Aztec domination. The conquest of the Aztec Empire wasn't simply Spanish versus Aztecs. It was Spanish allied with thousands of indigenous warriors from rival polities fighting against the Aztec state. Understanding this alliance structure is crucial to understanding how a small Spanish force could overthrow a major empire. Disease, too, played a decisive role. Smallpox arrived in Tenochtitlan during the Spanish siege, devastating the defenders while leaving the Spanish largely immune due to prior exposure. The epidemic killed an estimated one-third of the city's population in a matter of months, including the Aztec Emperor Cuitlahuac. This wasn't biological warfare in the modern sense. The Spanish didn't intentionally introduce disease, though they certainly benefited from its effects. Move south to Peru, and the pattern repeats with variations. When Francisco Pizarro arrived in 1532, the Inca Empire was already weakened by civil war, a succession dispute triggered partly by epidemic disease that had killed the previous emperor and created uncertainty about legitimate succession. Pizarro, like Cortés, commanded only a small force, but he exploited internal divisions, formed alliances with discontented subjects, and used technological advantages in crucial moments. The conquests weren't inevitable. They resulted from specific circumstances: disease outbreaks that weakened indigenous defenses, political divisions that prevented unified resistance, technological disparities in key areas, and individual decisions by indigenous leaders about whether to ally with or resist the newcomers. In different circumstances, outcomes might have been different. Indeed, in many regions, indigenous peoples successfully resisted European conquest for centuries. The northeastern woodlands saw different patterns of contact. Here, no large centralized empires existed to be conquered. Instead, Europeans encountered numerous autonomous communities with their own diplomatic protocols, military capabilities, and strategic interests. Initial relationships often involved trade. Europeans wanted furs, indigenous peoples wanted metal tools, cloth, and other European goods. These relationships could be cooperative, competitive, or hostile, depending on specific circumstances and individual actors. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, for instance, maintained substantial autonomy and power throughout the colonial period, playing European powers against each other, controlling key territories, and influencing the balance of power between French, English, and later American interests. They weren't passive victims of colonization, but active diplomatic and military players navigating a changing landscape. You're sitting now in a council meeting where indigenous leaders debate how to respond to European presence. Some argue for alliance, seeing opportunities for trade and military partnership against traditional enemies. Others advocate resistance, recognizing the threat to autonomy and land. Others propose cautious engagement, seeking to understand these newcomers better before committing to either cooperation or conflict. These aren't simple decisions. They're complex strategic calculations made with incomplete information about what European colonization will ultimately mean. The collision of worlds in the 1490s and beyond wasn't a simple story of technologically advanced Europeans encountering primitive indigenous peoples. It was a meeting of complex societies with different strengths, different technologies, different social organizations. The outcomes were shaped by disease, by military technology, by political alliances, by individual decisions, and by countless contingencies that might have unfolded differently. Understanding this complexity matters. It restores agency to indigenous peoples, recognizes their sophistication, and helps us see historical processes rather than predetermined outcomes. You're traveling along an ancient trade route in what is now the southeastern United States, around 1520. You've been to the coast, traded with communities there, and now you're returning inland to your home village several hundred miles away. You don't know it yet, but you're carrying something more consequential than any trade goods: microscopic pathogens that will reshape the entire demographic landscape of your world. Within days of your return, you develop a fever. Red spots appear on your skin, spreading across your body. Others in your village begin showing the same symptoms. The disease is smallpox, though you have no name for it, no framework for understanding what's happening. Your people have never encountered this illness before. No one has immunity. No one knows how to treat it. The mortality rate in your village will be catastrophic. But here's what makes this particularly devastating. You contracted the disease from coastal peoples who themselves caught it from sporadic European contact, perhaps from shipwrecked sailors, perhaps from brief trading encounters, perhaps from early exploratory expeditions. The disease traveled faster than European colonization itself, racing inland along established indigenous trade networks, jumping from community to community through normal patterns of social interaction. This pattern repeated across the Americas. Disease arrived first, colonization followed later. By the time European settlers reached many interior regions and began documenting what they observed, the demographic catastrophe had already occurred. They were seeing post-apocalyptic landscapes, not pristine wilderness untouched by human hands. The diseases came in waves. Smallpox was perhaps the most devastating, with mortality rates in virgin soil epidemics sometimes reaching 90% or higher. Measles followed, then influenza, typhus, diphtheria, mumps, whooping cough. Each wave killed a significant portion of those who had survived previous outbreaks. The cumulative effect was demographic collapse on a scale unprecedented in human history. Why were indigenous peoples so vulnerable? The answer lies in immunological history. Old World populations had lived with these diseases for millennia. Childhood exposure to measles or smallpox, if survived, typically conferred lifelong immunity. These diseases had become endemic, constantly present at low levels, primarily affecting children who hadn't yet been exposed. Adults had mostly survived childhood infections and were therefore immune. But in the Americas, no such immunological history existed. The diseases were entirely novel. When smallpox arrived, it affected everyone simultaneously: children, adults, elders. In many communities, so many people became sick at once that no one remained healthy enough to care for the ill, to prepare food, to maintain basic survival activities. People died not just from disease, but from the social breakdown that occurred when entire communities fell sick simultaneously. You're in a village now, 3 weeks after the disease arrived. The mortality is staggering. Perhaps half the population has died. Among the survivors, the social fabric has torn. Families have lost multiple members. Leadership structures have collapsed when chiefs and councils died. Knowledge holders, elders who maintained oral traditions, specialists who understood agricultural cycles, healers who treated other ailments, are gone, their accumulated wisdom dying with them. The survivors face impossible decisions. Do they remain in the village, now associated with death and loss? Do they flee to neighboring communities, potentially carrying disease with them? Do they attempt to maintain traditional practices with so few people, or do they need to fundamentally reorganize their society to function with drastically reduced numbers? Some scholars suggest the disease transmission began even before Columbus. There's evidence that Norse contact in the North Atlantic around 1000 CE may have introduced some diseases, though the scale and impact remain debated. Some researchers have proposed that pathogens might have crossed the Bering Strait through occasional contact, though this remains speculative. What's clear is that the systematic, sustained contact beginning in 1492 created conditions for pandemic spread on a continental scale. The speed of transmission outpaced European exploration by decades, sometimes by a century or more. When Hernando de Soto traveled through the southeast in 1540 to 1542, he encountered large, organized towns with substantial populations. When French explorers reached the same regions 150 years later, they found much smaller populations and abandoned settlements. The difference wasn't that De Soto exaggerated. Archaeological evidence confirms the larger earlier populations. The difference was disease transmission through indigenous networks before sustained European colonization occurred in those interior regions. In some cases, the demographic collapse was so complete that surviving communities lost the ability to maintain complex infrastructure. Agricultural systems that required coordinated labor became difficult to sustain. Large settlements consolidated into smaller ones. Political confederacies dissolved as their member communities disappeared or became too small to maintain their previous roles. The psychological impact is difficult to fully appreciate from historical distance. Imagine watching 80 or 90% of everyone you know die within a few years. Parents, children, siblings, friends, leaders, teachers. Imagine the cultural knowledge lost when elders die before training successors. Imagine the spiritual crisis when traditional healing practices fail against novel diseases, when ceremonies seem powerless against catastrophic mortality. Some indigenous oral traditions preserve memories of these epidemics, stories of times when people died in vast numbers, when villages were abandoned, when survivors had to reorganize their entire societies. These traditions, long dismissed by historians as mythological, increasingly align with archaeological and epidemiological evidence of catastrophic population decline. You're holding a wampum belt now, created to commemorate those lost in an epidemic. The purple and white beads encode memory, preserve history, mark the boundary between the time before, when populations were larger, when social structures were intact, and the time after, when everything changed. The belt will be read and reread in councils, its meaning explained to younger generations, ensuring that this history isn't forgotten even as its details become harder to remember with each passing year. The invisible factor, disease transmission faster than colonization, fundamentally shaped the history of European indigenous contact. It created landscapes that appeared empty but were actually emptied. It weakened societies before direct conflict occurred. It disrupted social structures and cultural transmission in ways that affected indigenous peoples' ability to resist colonization. Understanding this invisible factor changes how we interpret the history that followed, restoring context to processes that might otherwise seem inexplicable. The evening settles now into deeper quiet. The trade routes that once moved goods across continents also move pathogens. The social networks that connected distant communities also connected them in vulnerability. The sophistication of pre-Columbian societies, their trade systems, their mobility, their interconnection, became, tragically, a vector for their own demographic catastrophe. You're sitting in a council meeting sometime in the late 1600s. Around you are representatives from what were once three separate communities, now merged into one. The old villages, each with its own history, its own leadership, its own way of doing things, no longer have enough people to function independently. So the survivors have come together, bringing what they could carry, what they could remember, what they could preserve. This is reorganization, not disappearance, but adaptation. The meeting involves difficult negotiations, whose traditions will be maintained, whose leaders will be recognized, how to blend different practices into something coherent. Everyone has lost something, but together, they're creating something that can continue. Resilience in the face of catastrophic disruption took many forms across the Americas. Some communities relocated, moving to areas where resources were more abundant or where they could avoid colonial pressure. Others merged, as in the council you're observing, combining remnant populations into viable units. Still others reformed their social structures entirely, adopting new patterns of organization suited to changed circumstances. In the Southeast, the process historians call ethnogenesis, the formation of new ethnic identities, occurred as survivors from multiple devastated communities came together. The Creek Confederacy, for instance, emerged from the coalescence of numerous Mississippian-descended groups. The Seminoles formed from Creek migrants to Florida, combined with other indigenous peoples and African Americans escaping slavery. These weren't just random assemblages. They were deliberate reorganizations that created new political entities from the fragments of older ones. The Catawba Nation in the Carolinas similarly incorporated survivors from numerous smaller groups decimated by disease and colonial pressure. By the early 1700s, the Catawba included people from at least 20 different original communities, speaking multiple languages, maintaining diverse traditions, but united under a common political structure that provided strength through numbers. Move to the Great Plains, and you see different patterns of adaptation. As horses spread north from Spanish colonies, themselves an introduced species that transformed indigenous life. Plains peoples reorganized their economies and societies around mobile buffalo hunting on horseback. Groups that had been semi-sedentary farmers became nomadic hunters. New political structures emerged suited to this mobility. Military societies gained prominence. The classic Plains Indian culture that most Americans imagine actually developed largely in the 18th and 19th centuries, representing adaptation to changed circumstances rather than ancient tradition unchanged since time immemorial. In the Northeast, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy expanded, incorporating refugees and remnant populations from groups devastated by disease and warfare. The practice of adopting outsiders, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes through capture, helped maintain population levels and replaced losses from mortality. Adoptees could be fully incorporated into families and clans, gaining the same status as those born into the community. This flexibility helped the Confederacy survive demographic catastrophe that might otherwise have destroyed it. Cultural transmission continued despite disruption. Oral traditions adapted to preserve essential knowledge, even as the number of people who could remember and transmit them declined. Some traditions were necessarily simplified. There weren't enough people to maintain elaborate ceremonies that required dozens of participants. Other traditions became more important, serving as anchors of identity and continuity in a world that had changed dramatically. You're learning now from an elder who survived the epidemics as a child. She teaches you stories, songs, protocols that her grandparents taught her. But she also admits that some things were lost, ceremonies that required more participants than now exist, specific knowledge that died with particular specialists, details that no one alive can quite remember. What remains is precious, carefully guarded, passed down with the understanding that it represents survival against tremendous odds. Language preservation became crucial. As communities merged or populations declined, some languages disappeared entirely. Others persisted through conscious effort to teach children to use the language in ceremony even when English or Spanish or French became necessary for trade and diplomacy. The choice to maintain indigenous languages despite colonial pressure represented active resistance to cultural erasure. Material culture also demonstrated continuity and adaptation. Pottery styles might shift as different groups merged their traditions, but the practice of pottery making continued. Basket weaving incorporated new materials and new markets, selling baskets to colonists, while maintaining traditional techniques and designs. Clothing adapted to incorporate European cloth and metal ornaments, while retaining distinctively indigenous styles and meanings. Religious practices faced particular pressure as Christian missionaries sought conversions. Some indigenous peoples converted, finding in Christianity a framework that resonated with their own spiritual traditions or that provided social and economic advantages in colonial contexts. Others maintained traditional practices despite missionary pressure. Many blended elements, creating syncretic religions that combined indigenous and Christian elements in new configurations. All of these represent different strategies for navigating spiritual life under colonization. Political adaptation was essential for survival. Indigenous leaders learned to navigate colonial legal systems, to use European diplomatic protocols to play colonial powers against each other. The Haudenosaunee famously maintained diplomatic relationships with both French and English colonies, shifting alliances to preserve autonomy. Cherokee leaders adopted writing, created a constitutional government modeled partly on American structures, and attempted to demonstrate civilization in European terms, strategies that ultimately failed to prevent forced removal, but that showed sophisticated political thinking about how to survive in a colonial world. The removal policies of the 19th century, forced migrations like the Trail of Tears, represented another catastrophic disruption. Communities that had survived disease, warfare, and centuries of colonial pressure were forcibly relocated to unfamiliar territories. Yet even these forced migrations were survived. Communities reorganized in their new locations, maintained cultural practices despite displacement, and continued as distinct peoples. You're walking now through a community that has been reorganized multiple times, relocated, reduced, reformed, but still present. The houses might look different than they did generations ago. The language might be spoken by fewer people. The ceremonies might be simplified, but continuity persists through all the changes. Stories connect present generations to ancestors who lived before the catastrophes. Names carry forward. Clan structures endure. The community remains distinctly itself despite all that has changed. This resilience wasn't passive endurance. It was active adaptation, strategic decision-making, creative reorganization of social structures to fit changed circumstances. It required tremendous cultural flexibility while maintaining core elements of identity. It involved losses, knowledge that couldn't be preserved, practices that couldn't continue, languages that disappeared, but also remarkable persistence of cultural distinctiveness across centuries of disruption. The evening deepens into night now. The council meeting continues, voices steady and purposeful, working through the details of how to organize this merged community. Someone suggests maintaining both traditional leadership systems, giving each former village continued representation. Someone else proposes new ceremonies that can honor all the ancestors, not just those from one original community. Slowly, patiently, they're building something that can endure, drawing on old foundations to construct new structures suited to present realities. You're listening to a language that nearly disappeared. The last fluent speakers, perhaps only 3 or 4 of them, are teaching younger people who grew up speaking English or Spanish, but who have decided, as adults, to learn the language of their ancestors. The sessions are careful, patient. Each word carries weight. Each phrase represents recovery of something almost lost. This is happening now, today, in communities across the Americas. Languages that were spoken by thousands, that encoded entire worldviews and centuries of accumulated knowledge, that dwindled to handfuls of speakers, are being revived through conscious effort. It's not easy. The recordings are imperfect. The written materials were created by outsiders who didn't always capture pronunciation accurately. Grammatical structures have to be reconstructed from fragmentary sources. But the work continues because language represents more than communication. It represents a way of thinking, a connection to ancestors, a distinctively indigenous framework for understanding the world. The long memory persists through many channels. Oral traditions, despite disruptions, continue to transmit stories across generations. Some traditions have maintained continuity for centuries, preserved through careful teaching and regular recitation. Others have been revived after periods of dormancy, recovered from recordings made by anthropologists decades ago, or reconstructed from elder memories and archival materials. Ceremonial practices provide another channel of continuity. The green corn ceremony among southeastern peoples, the sun dance on the plains, the powwow traditions that have spread across North America. These gatherings maintain connections to older practices while adapting to contemporary circumstances. They create spaces where indigenous identity is affirmed, where cultural knowledge is transmitted, where communities gather in ways that echo patterns established long before colonization. Land itself carries memory. Sacred sites remain significant across centuries, even when access has been restricted by private property or government ownership. Mountains, springs, rock formations, specific groves of trees. These places anchor stories, mark boundaries, serve as settings for ceremonies, connect present generations to ancestors who knew these same places. When indigenous peoples fight for land rights or sacred site protection, they're not just claiming property in a legal sense. They're asserting relationships with specific places that have persisted across immense disruption. You're standing now at a site where your ancestors gathered for ceremonies centuries ago. The structures they built are gone, eroded by time, or destroyed by development. But the place itself remains. You know from stories that this is where certain rituals occurred, where leaders were invested with authority, where the community gathered at specific times of year. Standing here connects you to that continuity, despite all the changes that separate your world from theirs. Archaeological knowledge contributes to this long memory. When archaeologists work with indigenous communities, respectfully, collaboratively, their findings can supplement oral traditions, provide details that were lost, confirm stories that outsiders dismissed as mythology. The mounds that European Americans assumed were built by vanished races are now understood as the work of ancestors of present indigenous peoples. The sophisticated agricultural systems, the trade networks, the political organizations, all of this history belongs to living communities, not to disappeared peoples. Legal and political continuity matters too. Treaties signed in the 18th and 19th centuries remain legally binding, though often violated or ignored. Indigenous nations maintain government-to-government relationships with the United States and other countries. Tribal sovereignty, though limited and contested, provides legal frameworks for self-governance and cultural preservation. These structures represent continuity of political identity across centuries. Cultural revitalization movements have accelerated in recent decades. The American Indian movement of the 1970s sparked renewed attention to indigenous rights and cultural preservation. Language revival programs have proliferated. Traditional ecological knowledge is being documented and applied to contemporary environmental management. Indigenous artistic traditions, from beadwork to painting to film, are thriving, blending ancient techniques with contemporary forms. You're in a classroom now where children are learning their ancestral language. The teacher is young, herself a product of language revival programs. She didn't grow up speaking this language, but learned it as a teenager and dedicated her life to teaching it to the next generation. The children are engaged, practicing phrases, learning songs. They're growing up with access to something that almost disappeared, becoming part of a chain of transmission that links them to ancestors speaking this same language 1,000 years ago. The long memory isn't romantic or simple. It exists alongside trauma, alongside loss, alongside ongoing struggles for rights and resources. Many indigenous peoples live in poverty, face discrimination, deal with historical trauma's intergenerational effects. Health outcomes, educational attainment, economic opportunities, disparities persist, rooted in centuries of colonization and its continuing effects. But the memory also represents resilience. It's the persistence of distinctive identities despite immense pressure to assimilate. It's the maintenance of languages that were forbidden in boarding schools. It's the continuation of ceremonies that missionaries tried to suppress. It's the assertion that indigenous peoples haven't disappeared, that the cultures aren't extinct, that the long arc from pre-Columbian civilizations to present indigenous communities remains unbroken. Governance structures demonstrate this continuity. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy still operates, still follows the Great Law of Peace, still meets in council to discuss matters affecting member nations. Cherokee Nation maintains elected government, operates schools and hospitals, exercises sovereignty over its territory. Countless other indigenous nations, each with its own history, its own government, its own cultural practices, continue as distinct political entities. Traditional ecological knowledge represents another form of long memory. The understanding of plant properties, seasonal patterns, animal behavior, water systems, knowledge accumulated over millennia, persists in communities that maintain connection to land. This knowledge is increasingly recognized as valuable for contemporary environmental management, offering insights that complement scientific approaches. You're gathering plants now with someone who learned this knowledge from grandparents who learned it from their grandparents, stretching back through generations. Each plant has names, properties, uses, stories attached to it. This isn't abstract botanical knowledge. It's lived relationship with landscape, practical understanding developed through countless generations of observation and experience. The person teaching you can identify dozens of medicinal plants, knows when to harvest them, how to prepare them, what they treat. This knowledge survived colonization, survived forced relocation, survived boarding schools that tried to erase it. It survived because people chose to preserve it, to pass it down, to maintain the connection. The evening grows quieter still. The long memory stretches behind you. Thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, cultural practices, political structures, relationships with land. And it stretches ahead. Languages being revived, traditions being maintained, communities asserting continued existence, insisting on recognition not as historical curiosities, but as living peoples with ongoing claims to identity, sovereignty, and cultural distinctiveness. The thread connects past to present to future, tested severely, but never quite broken, maintained through conscious effort and deep commitment to continuity. You're watching the sun set over land that has been inhabited for 12,000 years. The specific peoples have changed, migrations, transformations, the rise and fall of cultures, but the human presence has been continuous. This is an ancient history in the sense of something finished, sealed off in the past. It's living history, flowing from deep time into the present moment. The story we've traced tonight, from Cahokia's mounds to managed forests, from geometric earthworks to continental trade routes, from agricultural innovations to political confederacies, through demographic catastrophe and resilient reorganization, isn't a story of vanished peoples. It's a story of transformation and persistence, of cultures that adapted to immense pressures while maintaining core elements of identity across centuries. Today, there are 574 federally recognized indigenous nations in the United States alone, each with its own government, its own history, its own cultural practices. In Canada, there are over 600 First Nations. In Mexico and Central America, indigenous peoples number in the tens of millions. In South America, from the Andes to the Amazon, indigenous communities maintain languages, traditions, and territorial claims rooted in histories that extend back millennia. These aren't museum pieces. They're living cultures engaged with contemporary issues: environmental protection, economic development, education, healthcare, political representation. Indigenous peoples are doctors, lawyers, artists, scientists, teachers, politicians. They participate fully in modern society while also maintaining distinctive cultural identities and political sovereignties. The environmental knowledge we discussed, that understanding of landscape management, of plant properties, of ecological relationships, is increasingly recognized as crucial for addressing contemporary challenges. Climate change, biodiversity loss, sustainable resource management. In all these areas, traditional ecological knowledge offers insights that complement scientific approaches. Indigenous managed lands often show higher biodiversity than surrounding areas, testament to management practices developed over millennia. The political structures, those confederacies and consensus-based decision-making systems, continue to influence contemporary governance. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy still meets in council. Many indigenous nations operate sophisticated governmental systems that balance traditional structures with modern administrative requirements. These aren't historical curiosities, but functioning political organizations with real authority over significant territories and populations. Cultural production thrives. Indigenous artists work in traditional media and contemporary forms. Native literature, film, music, and visual arts contribute to broader cultural conversations while maintaining distinctive voices rooted in indigenous experiences and worldviews. Powwows, ceremonies, language camps, cultural centers. All these create spaces where indigenous identity is affirmed and transmitted to younger generations. The legal landscape continues to evolve. Court cases clarify treaty rights, affirm hunting and fishing rights, sometimes return land to indigenous control. The process is slow, often frustrating, marked by setbacks as well as victories. But movement occurs, recognition increases, sovereignty is asserted and sometimes acknowledged. You're sitting quietly now, letting the weight of this history settle. 12,000 years of human presence on this continent. Sophisticated civilizations that built cities, managed landscapes, developed agricultural systems, created political structures, maintained trade networks spanning thousands of miles. Then catastrophic disruption, disease, colonization, forced removal, and through it all, persistence. Adaptation, survival, continuity maintained despite everything. The mounds are still there, though many were destroyed by plowing or development. The trade routes became highways. The managed forests grew wild, then were logged, then are being understood again as cultural landscapes. The languages that nearly disappeared are being taught in schools. The ceremonies that were forbidden are practiced openly. The political structures that colonizers tried to erase assert continuing sovereignty. This isn't a story with a neat ending because it's not finished. Indigenous peoples continue to negotiate their place in contemporary society, to assert rights, to maintain cultures, to adapt traditions to new circumstances. The challenges are real: poverty, discrimination, health disparities, ongoing struggles over land and resources. But so is the resilience, the creativity, the refusal to disappear despite centuries of pressure. The evening air carries a softness now, a quietness that invites rest. You've traveled tonight from Cahokia's rising pyramids through managed forests and geometric earthworks, along continental trade routes, through agricultural innovations and political structures, into demographic catastrophe and persistent reorganization, arriving finally here, in the present, where the long arc of indigenous history continues unbroken into an open future. The civilizations beneath the myths weren't simple, weren't primitive, weren't vanished. They were complex, sophisticated, adaptive. They built knowledge into landscapes, encoded wisdom in oral traditions, organized societies according to principles that worked for centuries. They experienced catastrophic disruption, but didn't disappear. They reorganized, adapted, maintained core elements of identity while changing what needed to change for survival. Understanding this history changes how we see the present. Indigenous peoples aren't remnants of the past, but participants in ongoing histories that stretch back millennia and forward into futures they're actively shaping. The land wasn't empty. The forests weren't wilderness. The cultures didn't vanish. All of it persists, transformed but continuous, challenging us to see complexity where we once saw simplicity, to recognize sophistication where we assumed primitive existence, to acknowledge living peoples where we imagined vanished races. Let that knowledge settle as you settle towards sleep. The history is there in the land itself, in continuing communities, in languages being revived, in ceremonies maintained across generations. The long memory holds it all, the achievements, the catastrophes, the resilience, the ongoing presence. It's not a story of what was lost, though much was lost. It's a story of what persists, what adapts, what continues despite everything. The stars emerge above, the same stars that guided travelers along ancient trade routes, that aligned with earthwork observatories, that mark seasonal changes for agricultural calendars still consulted today. Time deepens into rest. The journey ends not with finality, but with continuity, with the understanding that what we've explored tonight connects directly to living communities maintaining histories that extend back farther than most civilizations can trace. Rest now in that knowledge. The mounds endure. The stories persist. The peoples continue. History flows forward, carrying forward the accumulated wisdom of millennia, adapting to each new challenge, maintaining through all transformations the essential thread of cultural identity and human presence on this ancient, storied land. The journey we've taken tonight stretched across 12,000 years and 2 continents, from the earliest arrival of peoples in the Americas through the development of sophisticated civilizations, across catastrophic disruptions, and into the present where indigenous nations continue as living cultures. We've seen that the narratives many of us learned of empty wilderness, primitive peoples, vanished civilizations don't match the archaeological and historical evidence. What we've explored instead is complexity, cities that rivaled European capitals, agricultural systems that fed millions, trade networks spanning thousands of miles, political structures built on consensus and representation, environmental management so sophisticated it shaped entire landscapes. We've witnessed demographic catastrophe unprecedented in scale, but also resilience, communities that survived, adapted, reorganized, and maintained cultural continuity despite immense pressure. This history matters not as correction for correction's sake, but because it restores depth to our understanding. It recognizes indigenous peoples as they were and are, diverse, innovative, adaptive, enduring. It acknowledges sophistication where simplicity was assumed, continuity where disappearance was imagined, agency where passivity was projected. As you drift toward sleep, carry with you this understanding. The Americas weren't empty, weren't waiting to be discovered, weren't inhabited by peoples without history or achievement. They were and remain home to cultures with deep roots, accumulated knowledge, political structures, artistic traditions, and ongoing claims to identity and sovereignty. The civilizations beneath the myths were real, were remarkable, and in transformed but continuous ways persist. The long arc of indigenous history, from Poverty Point to Cahokia, from the Great Law of Peace to contemporary tribal governments, from Teosini to the Three Sisters systems still planted today, traces human ingenuity, resilience, and persistence across millennia. That story continues, written by living peoples engaged with contemporary challenges while maintaining connections to ancestors who shaped this land long before European ships appeared on the horizon. Rest in the quietness of deep time. Rest knowing that history is more complex, more interesting, more ongoing than simple narratives suggest. Rest with respect for the peoples who built, survived, adapted, and continue, carrying forward knowledge accumulated across centuries, maintaining identities tested by catastrophe, asserting presence in a world that too often imagined them vanished. The mounds stand in the landscape. The languages are being revived. The ceremonies continue. The nations govern. The long memory holds everything. The achievements, the tragedies, the transformations, the endurance. History flows forward, and you've touched its current tonight, felt its depth, recognized its ongoing movement into futures yet unwritten. Sweet dreams.